In this period, there was a rise of various sorts of organizing because many workers saw the Roosevelt administration as potentially much less hostile to organizing than the Hoover administration had been. As yet, there was actually very little real reforms under Roosevelt, but there was a rebirth of hope. Starting in the spring of 1934, there was a chain of mass strikes, general strikes, in the United States, believe it or not. In April of 1934, there was a strike at a parts plant in Toledo, the Autolite parts plant. The workers tried to picket. Judges enjoined them, prohibited them from picketing. But a unemployed organization, which had previously existed, offered to set up a mass picket. On the first day, there were 1,000 unemployed workers picketing the Autolite plant. On the second day, there were 2,000. By the end of the week, the mass picket had grown to 10,000. Both unemployed workers and workers drawn from other plants that started going out on strike in sympathy with the Autolite strikers. The police in Toledo tried to disperse this huge crowd. There were pitched battles between the police and the strikers, very similar to some of the events that we recently saw in the early phases of the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions. In the end, the police were completely outnumbered and were routed. The National Guard was brought in. The mass strike grew to include almost the entire city. So Toledo was basically in a general strike. While these events were happening, in Minneapolis, a truckers' strike broke out. And the truckers had a central marketplace where almost all of the goods moved in and out. There was a very similar scenario. The truckers set up a picket line. The police moved to break it. There were a general melee, and when the National Guard was brought in, the workers called for help from other workers. Again, the unemployed joined on the side of the workers, and Minneapolis almost came to a complete stop. While both of these things were happening in the Midwest, there was a dock workers' strike all across the west coast of the United States. This was particularly hard fought in San Francisco, where picket lines were set up and workers were physically preventing scabs from unloading the ships. Again, there was repression. Again, there was a mass battle by the police and the workers. Again, the workers were able to draw upon tens of thousands of workers from other industries who came to their defense. And when the National Guard was brought in to open the port and by overwhelming force to suppress the workers' picket line, and at this time machine gun nests were set up on the docks to essentially mow down anyone who dared to set up a picket line. Workers in several industries in San Francisco spontaneously started to go out on strike. And when this strike had, over a process of a couple of days, spread, the union leaders, seeing this movement get out of their own control, decided to call formally a general strike. The general strike lasted for 5 days. By the end of this 5-day strike, the workers themselves were essentially in control of San Francisco. They were organizing, they were giving out permits to truckers to deliver emergency supplies. of food or hospital supplies. They were essentially running the city. And the capitalists at this period became so frightened that they essentially imposed upon the shippers a settlement that over a period of months led to the recognition of the Union and a great improvement in the conditions of the dock workers. So during this period, lasting essentially three or 4 months, from April to July, 3 major cities in the United States were simultaneously involved in the mass strikes. Out of this entire process, the employers and the ruling class generally realized that sheer repression was not going to control this movement. In 1935, there were major concessions that came out of the government because the Roosevelt administration felt that they had to give concessions to try and get control of this movement and channelize it in such a way that it would not lead to revolution in the United States. Some of these concessions were the legalization of unions by the Wagner Act, the putting in place of unemployment compensation, the Social Security Act. These were major concessions that improved the lot of workers. In the United States, this also led to a huge wave of union organizing, and in 1936, another wave of more dispersed mass strikes that involved the occupations of the plants, the famous sit-down strikes of 1936. There's one final example I want to discuss historically, which is the general strikes of France in 1968. Now, both these earlier examples, obviously, were long before the development of the internet. In Russia in 2005, even telephones were relatively rare. But even much more primitive means of communication, newspapers, telegrams, enabled workers to spread these strikes. It could be argued, well, yeah, these are all phenomena of repressive societies, such as Tsarist Russia, such as present-day Egypt under Mubarak, or even the United States, a democracy in which unions were essentially prohibited. Strikes were almost outlawed in the 1930s. But if we look at 1968 in France, we look at a country with a lot of modern mass media communication, television, radio, a parliamentary democracy, even though with a very strong presidency. Unions were completely legal, strikes were legal, and yet, again, we see the same pattern of a discredited regime, individual strikes starting locally and then spreading in the face of repression into a general conflagration involving the entire working class. So what happened in France was, the context was that the French government under de Gaulle had launched a period of austerity. They were very similar to what a lot of governments are trying to impose today. They were imposing wage cuts, a decrease in the size of public education, a decrease in pensions and benefits, and restrictions on union rights. The flashpoint was actually a student movement. In the spring of 1968, there was a demonstration at Nanterre University, which is in a suburb of Paris, and the students went on strike. The school was closed in retaliation, and the students went to the Sorbonne, the largest and most famous of the public universities in Paris, to ask for help. And the students at the Sorbonne started to demonstrate against the planned reforms that were going to reduce the scale of public education in France. Again, there was repression. When the students started to demonstrate, the police started to break up the demonstrations and repress them. The response was that the demonstrations got larger and larger, more and more schools were involved. The repression got larger and larger until in the center of France, students were setting up barricades. There were pitched battles between the students and the CRS, which was the National Guard of France. At the beginning of May, the unions found that many of their members were expressing more and more sympathy for the students, which the union leadership had initially opposed. So in order to try and get control of the movement, the unions declared a mass demonstration in Paris on May 3rd. May 13th. 1 to 2 million workers came into Paris in one of the largest demonstrations that the city had ever seen. Out of this demonstration and under its massive protection, the students occupied the Sorbonne. But the workers were also confronted with this mass austerity that affected the whole class. So the next day, workers in one of the publicly owned factories, Sud Aviation, occupied their plant and went on strike. At this time, I myself was a student at Columbia University. We had just had a student strike where we occupied the buildings. And I remember saying, the French are imitating us. I didn't try and repeat that in France, however. Actually, in 1968, similar movements on a smaller scale were happening in almost every of the developed countries, in many of the developing countries, including in Mexico. In France, the movement went the furthest. Within days, this occupation movement had spread throughout the entire country, so that by the end of May, 10 million workers, nearly half the total French workforce, was on strike and was occupying the plants. By this time, the demands had gone way beyond the defensive demands to undo the reforms that de Gaulle had proposed, the austerity. They were making significant economic demands for shorter hours, higher working, higher wages, expansion of public education, and they were making political demands as well for the resignation of de Gaulle, for a constituent convention to redo the French Constitution, and many workers were calling for a workers' government to take over the plants and to run them in the interests of the workers. The revolution was not successful. In the end, the leaders of the CGT, the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, were able to persuade the workers to end the strike, short of a revolutionary change. But again, the ruling class was so frightened that there were, in this period, from 68 to approximately 1970, there were immense concessions